Well, thanks for coming, everyone. Yeah. David Sprules, the school president, was just remarking on how long it's been since we've had, right, this many people in our auditorium. And we know the reason why, seated here to my left. Am I right? Yeah.
Yeah, but lots of my office.
So I'm going to do some quick housekeeping, David, and talk about this series a little bit, and then we're going to jump right in. So I'm Dennis Scully. I'm the host of the Business at Home podcast, and I'm also the curator of the Dialogues on Design series here at the New York School of Interior Design. And for those of you that don't know, this is one of our big scholarship fundraisers. So through sponsorships and subscriptions, and thankfully this year, individual ticket sales too, we raise money for our various scholarship programs, including our diversity scholarship program and our pre-college scholarship program, where we hope to introduce young people to interior design from communities that are often underrepresented. I'm grateful to all of those who have helped make this series possible, and I want to give special thanks to Holly Hunt, Kathy Doyle, Andrea Feinstock, Ellen Kravitz, Kravitz Inc., Peter Penoyer, Cynthia Murphy, and Gil Schaefer. Will you just join me in giving them a round of applause? I appreciate that very much. Their generosity is greatly appreciated by the school and by the students. So tonight, I have the pleasure, you all have the pleasure of joining me in speaking with world-renowned interior designer, at least, a member of the Interior Design Hall of Fame on any number of the world's top designer lists, including the AD 100 list, and a winner of the Albert Hadley Lifetime Achievement Award from the New York School of Interior Design, which I know had special meaning to David.
Indeed.
Which we will talk about. And we're fortunate enough to also have David on our board of directors here at the school, so we are especially thankful for that. Will you please join me in welcoming? So the reason I mentioned about the Albert Hadley Award having special significance for David, and part of what we wanted to talk about originally when we were first getting together, David and I, to figure out where we wanted to go with this conversation, much of it was around mentorship and what you learned over the years working for another world-renowned practice of Parrish Hadley. And David and I both feel strongly that we want to encourage students here in the front row to go and work for a firm and learn and train. And so we're going to talk about that.
It's a song I've been singing for a long time because, and it can sound a little duplicitous that I sit in, here at the New York School of Interior Design, and I'm very proud to be on the board, but I didn't attend a design school.
Well, yes, yes.
In my day, it was a little more difficult to say when I was a sort of young man who should have been a lawyer or a doctor that I wanted to be an interior decorator. And so the only school that was even something I could say out loud was going to be architecture school. And then I ended up going to work during my summer holidays while I was at college, Trinity College, Hartford, Connecticut. You can imagine how many people were interested in interior design.
Small number.
That would be none. But I came to work for interior designers over the summers. And then when I graduated, I stayed. I worked for Robert Denning and Vincent Fourcade, who were very well known at the time, doing very elaborate, very interesting work, things I had never seen, certainly in my experience or exposure, and then stayed in the field. So I am a huge proponent, I say to people all the time, I didn't go to school, but I did get to sit across the desk from Albert Hadley for 16 years, so that probably made up for it. And I don't say that lightly. It was incredibly essential. And anyone, and I'm kidding when I say half the room is my office, but there are people in my office, and I've had people, over the years, I've enjoyed lots of long-term relationships with past, present, future employees, and they've all heard me endlessly start a meeting, or a reference to Albert and what I learned from him, whether it's looking at a scheme, and we'll talk about it at length, but
Yeah. Well, and what's also important in that to point out is that you long had your eyes focused on going to work for Albert Hadley. It didn't happen right away. In fact, at first when you met
No.
Albert Hadley, there wasn't actually a job for you at the time.
No, there wasn't a job for me, but I did know what I had a goal. I mean, once I figured out what I wanted to do, which was singing and dancing.
That's
What
he did actually want to be a dancer originally.
I did want to.
So
Truth
that
be told, it's absolutely true. So not only could
Yeah.
I not say I wanted
Right.
to be an interior decorator, I really couldn't say I wanted to go and be a ballet dancer. So but anyway, but I say I would have ended up being a decorator anyway. So, but once I figured out what I wanted to do and I had started to work in the firm, in the field, I started in those days. There were lots of shelter magazines and things, and I just used to look and look and look and look and sort of look. And there wasn't the proliferation of design books that are out now. I mean, I make it sound like it was 100 years ago, but it was, sort of the mid-'70s, late '70s. And, the bookstores had, obviously, design books, but not like they do today. So the icons to me were Billy Baldwin, and he was really no longer working. And when I looked at the work that I really admired, there was Albert Hadley. I didn't know who Albert Hadley was. He was sort of this person in a book and in magazines. And then I figured out, there was Parrish Hadley, and, I became less stupid and figured things out. And I thought, well, and then that's where I want to go to work. And as I said to you earlier, it's not like I was being so arrogant. I was just completely naive. I thought, well, I like what they do, so I
right.
That's
sure,
where
they're
I
the
want to
top
go.
firm in the country. Of course,
Right.
that's where I want to go.
That's where I want to go.
Yeah.
And so I sort of presented myself on more than one occasion to Albert in various forms and guises of, is there a job? And I'll do anything. I'll return samples. I don't care. And that job had just been given away to someone else who ended up driving the car first, and then became a decorator at the office. And it was it was about 5 years before I got hired at Parrish Hadley.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
I must have been really annoying.
Well, I mean, and you were working for the lovely Bulgarian designer.
I
that
worked for the most wonderful woman. So of course I worked in the field, and after I left Denning and Forcoat, because I was working for Summers, and then I went to work for them full time, but they weren't really set up for me, and I went to work for a woman named Mara Palmer, who was the most charming, most fun, most wonderful woman, and I worked for her for 5 years. She was great. She came from Bulgaria. She had escaped when the Russians came. She had lived in Italy. She had lived in France. She lived in Switzerland. She spoke 7 languages. She was a great cook. She used to, drink a glass of champagne and whiz it around with a fork to get the bubbles out. She was the smoked nonstop. She was the chicest thing. I'd never known a woman like this, growing up in Great Neck in Long Island. I never knew anyone like this existed.
hadn't been exposed to this.
She was great. She could she would talk to the Polish worker over here and the Russian worker over there and, the German guy. She was fantastic. And I worked with her for 5 years, and it was just her and myself and a secretary, and it was great. It was super great training, and I learned to do so much. And, I would pick the rug out, I would type the estimate up for it, and I would go and deliver the rug and spread it down my, it was a real start to finish job, and it was great. And 5 years into it, finally there was a position at Parish Hadley. And I told Mara I was going to leave. And she said to me, if you're not going to work for Albert, I will never speak to you again. And I said, I am going to work for Albert. And she said, then we're fine. And she said, you only have to promise me one thing. And I said, what? She said, you'll hire your replacement. And I said, okay, fine. And for the rest of the years Mara worked, and she worked for many years, I hired every one of her assistants.
He was the head of the HR department for a firm he no longer worked for.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that story. Yeah.
It's pretty great.
And I think that says so much about you and also the relationships that you make.
I think my English was just better.
But finally the job at Parish Hadley did become available, and we keep referencing Albert, and you thought you were going to be working with Albert so much, but it turned out, initially at least, the dynamic was...
Oh, it was a total bait and switch.
Mrs. Parrish much more had her eye on
I was
you.
going to work for Albert Hadley. I thought I was going to be one of Albert's boys. In those days, we were all known as Albert's boys because we all looked the same. We all wore, actually weirdly, I'm almost wearing the same thing. We all wore gray flannel pants and a blue blazer and a white shirt and a dark tie. In those days, you wore ties to work. And we all looked the same, and we were thought of as Albert's boys. And when I got to work there, literally before I actually started, Mrs. Parrish's secretary called me up and said, would you meet Mrs. Parrish, Tuesday at, 8:30 next week? And I said, but I don't work there yet.
I haven't actually started yet.
Yeah, right. But I said, yeah, sure. And we got in the car, and she took me off to see a project that we were going to work on. And I worked on projects with Mrs. Parrish pretty consistently for the first 8 to 10 years. I did work with Albert, of course, on things, but I worked more with Mrs. Parrish. And it was the most wonderful thing because my own natural instincts were more aligned with Albert. And so working with Mrs. Parrish forced me to, or exposed me to think in a way that I hadn't really been thinking. Of course, it used to amuse the hell out of me because I thought, now here's Sister Parrish, from, Dorothy May Kennicott, and David Allen Kleinberg. Well, they've got a lot in common. But we had I had a great working relationship with her.
Well, and it's so interesting, and so many of your former colleagues talk about the relationship that you developed with Mrs. Parrish, much to, they were a bit jealous, frankly, of the relationship that you had, and they thought, well, what do the two of them have in common? Zero, and yet they seem to be thick as thieves.
Yeah, until Libby Cameron was hired, and then I was kicked to the curb. Because then there was somebody Mrs. Parrish could really relate to. But yeah, no, Mrs. Parrish was, she respected things that, someone of her generation, you would expect them to respect. She, hard work, honesty, a certain amount of integrity, backbone. Mrs. Parrish was great if you had presence. And I'm not the most shy retiring person. And so so the first time I presented some schemes and she walked out of the room kind of across them, kicking them out of her way, I just thought, guess she didn't like them, better do them again. Instead of being crumbled by it, I just thought, oh, all right, back at it.
Yeah.
So we just got on. And if I got out of line, she let me know it. And if she got out of line, I just shut up.
Well, and as we go through some of the slides that we're going to share, we can talk about some of the foundational teaching that she gave to you about how people live and about comfort. But it's interesting the difference between Albert's dynamic and Mrs. Parrish's dynamic. He had a very different sensibility and a very different way of working. Tell us about that.
Well, everybody's so much has been written about and talked about how that, Albert was very intellectual and had a very architectural approach to things. And he, started with the box and the shell, and he talked about, the architecture of the house or the building or what you were doing, and everything was, there was a furniture plan and an elevation, and you started at the front door and you really kind of moved through the space. And what was that experience like? He would talk about the landscape of a room, and so everyone who is in my office is bored with me making them do elevations and put it on elevation, and what is it? How does it scale in? Mrs. Parrish was the absolute opposite. It pushed to a point. She really couldn't tell you why she felt the way she did. But she had a great inherent instinct as to, she couldn't tell you that window faced east and this one faced west and the sun would be here. But she could walk into a room and you would gravitate to where you would want to be at various points in the day. She would know where people would go for a drink. She would know where people would want to sit after dinner. She would know. But if you asked her to explain it, she couldn't, and if you pushed her, she'd almost get frustrated. She also couldn't draw a furniture plan to scale. I probably kept some of them. They are like, Yoji Kusama crazy drawings. But she could push furniture into place better than anyone I knew, and pick up the vacuum when everything was done and clean up. She was a no-nonsense. She was great. But Albert was super, super generous with his knowledge. And so my favorite times, and anyone who's worked for them will say, I think, the same thing. My favorite times were sort of 6 o'clock, and you'd sit opposite the desk, and Albert had a clipboard with tracing paper, sheets of tracing paper. And you would sit and you would talk about a job, and you would talk about possibilities. What if, why not, what could it be? Those great conversations. And Albert would sketch. And so you'd spend 45 minutes talking, and then at the end of it, he'd hand you a drawing. And it was the most extraordinary thing, this conversation made physical. And then he'd say, okay, let's go get a drink, which was great. But and he would explain to you about the proportion of things. Well, the ceiling height is this, maybe we should have a 4-poster bed. It would all come into place. And you would have a different conversation with Mrs. Parrish. So all of us who had this experience of these two left brain, right brain people in our ears, I think that's why we turned out with this kind of body of experience. It was remarkable. It's sort of like there were these moments in time. There was, Studio 54, and there was Parrish Hadley, But they were both kind of remarkable in different ways.
Well, and it's interesting that you say that, because you started, it was 1981, Ronald Reagan had just come into office, and the world was about to change so dramatically. The roaring 80s were about to begin. You'd never know it from this first picture that it was a good time at the office. This group looks a little, what's happened to this group?
I don't know, maybe one of the dogs just died.
Yeah.
I don't know, but
they're a little stunned.
I tried to find pictures. I said to Dennis, I was really trying to find pictures from my Parrish Hadley days, and I couldn't find so many, and then I unearthed this one. So this was like a group shot for a magazine portrait. So from the left, it's Brian McCarthy, and then a lovely man standing just behind Mrs. Parrish called David McMahon, and David was a wonderful architect who worked in the office for years. He sadly has passed away. Mrs. Parrish, Albert, the wonderful Gary Hager, who's my great buddy at the office, who was the guy who got the job driving the car.
But who later helped you get your job.
He did.
Yes.
He did. He was the guy who called me up and said, there's a job. Do you want to come and talk to them? Then Bunny Williams.
Yes. You couldn't recognize Bunny from this emaciated, tortured look here that I don't know what they were doing to her at the time.
And
but,
then me, who
and
looks like
then-
I've just been stabbed in the foot.
And then, yes,
So
yes.
I don't really know. But that was going back a few years, and we were in front of some model that, we had, it was being presented for.
Some sprawling property
Some
that you were.
small
yes,
little house
Yes.
in-
I can't help but notice the tennis courts and, yeah.
I think it was in addition a tennis court, pool house, something or other. But
Yeah,
anyway,
yeah.
so that, but that was where, but also, it was, the mentorship wasn't just Albert and Mrs. Parrish, it was Brian McCarthy.
Yeah.
He turned out to be a nobody. And, David, who was a really great young architect, and then, oh, gee, Bunny, well, she really had no taste then. So, so we were all running around doing these things. So there was also this other, there was a second layer of collaboration that was also incredibly strong, and the influence of it, I would look at something Bunny was doing and I would think, oh, huh, something I might not have thought about. And so, you were looking at all these things going on. So, being in that environment, it's irreplaceable. So this is what I'm constantly trying to get across is, I just, all I had to do was sit there, and it just came banging at me in a remarkable way, and that's an irreplaceable experience.
Yeah, yeah. And you were there for, 16.
Yeah, I know. I would have been the best husband in life because, I would never leave. So, I just stay. But I was there for 16 years because, well, one, when I finally got the job, and then I realized I was now working for this firm that was really rather formidable and had this amazing reputation. I thought, oh God, please don't let them figure this out, that I shouldn't be here, the great imposter syndrome that so many people have. And then I just thought, where could I ever go? I'm working for these people I have such respect for in this little world I want to be in. Where would I ever go? And while I saw people move on, Bunny certainly, Brian moved on before I did. It just didn't, I stayed. Mrs. Parrish passed away, I stayed. Gary passed away, I stayed. I just had such enormous pride, and I still thought, if I walk into an office and Albert isn't there, who am I going to ask a question of? What am I going to do? And I, figured it out, but, and everyone knows, I say this all the time, if I'm the only person in my office now with an idea, the lights would be shut off in an hour. We'd be right out of business, so.
Well, and you very sweetly, you went to Albert to tell him you were leaving, and you actually asked him to come and join you at your new firm.
I said, it's finally time for me to go. I didn't really want to go, but it became very clear that, my stay was up and I really did need to step out into the traffic. And I did say to him, I said, the only thing I want is I'd like to know if you'd like to come with me. Because I really didn't want to leave him.
Yeah.
He was, I just had such respect for him. And he was, he was just a sweetheart. He was just the nicest damn guy, so you just wanted to spend time with him. You didn't want to go to his house for dinner.
And tell them why. And tell them why not.
Because Albert had. So the difference is, Mrs. Parrish really knew how to make, how to entertain and make people comfortable, and she could organize that. You go to Albert's, and there'd be a small dish of peanuts, and there'd be, a bottle of gin because Albert drank gin, and there might be a bottle of vodka in the kitchen in the freezer somewhere, and so you would go and make yourself a drink. And then it never occurred to Albert that you ever got hungry. Well, we were all young. So Gary and I would often go, sometimes David, we were these young guys. We were in our late 20s, early 30s, you're hungry. And we would sit there and, drink with Albert. And Albert was a great drinker. He never seemed to get drunk. We all got drunk. And so Albert was perfectly happy having a cigarette and a gin.
and we'd be starving.
Yeah.
And so finally, we would either stand up and say, "Okay, we're all going to get something to eat," or when we would leave, we would finally run to get a piece of pizza because we were so hungry. But he didn't remember.
This is why they're all so thin in the program. He was depriving them, and he didn't even have a place to put your drink down, or so.
He didn't have a dish to put. He barely had plates in his kitchen. He was, so you think about decorators now, and you think, we do all this stuff. We do, and I do. Like, I'm so tedious about, bath accessories and serving dishes and tablescapes. And now, I'm not the greatest at tablescapes, but I like to make sure we have, placemats and all the things we need. But Albert never trained any of us to have any of that. I don't think I ever saw Albert Hadley set a dining table. No, he could do flowers. I can't touch a flower. He told me years ago, don't touch a flower. But he would, I don't think I ever saw him set a table.
Whereas Mrs. Parrish was all about.
She was all about that, hearth, home, family, everything she was all about that. So again, they were very different people. Christmas party at Albert's house was 2 bowls of peanuts and plenty to drink. But Christmas party at Mrs. Parrish's was ham, deviled eggs, Christmas dinner.
Yeah.
So it was just different.
I loved the story that you told of that trip when you were first driving up to Greenwich with Mrs. Parrish, and she had made peanut butter and egg sandwiches and was passing them to you while you were driving.
Mrs. Parrish had a housekeeper whose name was Pilar, whose name I will never forget. And Pilar used to pack kind of picnic lunches when we would go driving to New Jersey to a project, or, and we get in the car, and so sometimes if I was really trusted, I would be behind the wheel. Initially, Mrs. Parrish drove, which was the most terrifying experience of my life. I mean, she was well into her 70s when I went to work there, and she would get in the front seat of a big green Oldsmobile station wagon, some kind of station wagon, but it was green, dark green, Pekingese in her lap, and drive to Greenwich, and I would be clutching and then, she finally let me start to drive, and Pilar would pack these lunches, which was a peanut butter, I hate peanut butter, I'm a strange person, no jelly, peanut butter on white bread, and hard-boiled eggs that she hadn't peeled. And Mrs. Parrish would sit in the passenger seat next to me and peel a hard-boiled egg.
Peel the shell off.
And hand it to me. So I would be given to eat, nothing to drink.
Nothing to drink.
A hard-boiled egg with bits of shell and tiny bits of red nail polish.
It was such a great experience for you. You learned so much.
And who said decorating is such an elegant career?
Yes. And you could have run right there. This was early days. Could have said, I've made a terrible mistake.
I thought I was living large. I thought I had hit the jackpot. I would get out of the car covered in the hair of 2 Pekingese dogs.
Yes, but then you pull up. And this is the house. So you go, okay, I'll stay.
Well, this
was
was actually the second project I worked on. The first project we went to in Greenwich was for old clients of Mrs. Parrish. Described the house we were going to on this first trip, from the front door through every room in the house. She knew, she couldn't draw a floor plan, but she remembered everything. She knew where everything was. She was insanely visual. This was a project, so this was up in Conyers Farm in Greenwich, Connecticut. This was an old ruin on a big estate that got developed.
The architect on this was Alan Wansenberg. Alan was also, he's a couple of years older than I am. And so, we went up to the project and it was a wreck. And so we walked through it. And this was the first project I really worked on with Mrs. Parrish where, she kind of turned it over to me and said, okay, you're the project decorator, although it wasn't called that in those days. And so this was, I show these pictures and we can go through them quickly. It's sort of the most full, country house decoration. This was early 80s, the use of chintz, sisal carpet strewn all over. It was a great time to shop in London because the dollar and the pound were equal in these days. And this client was a fantastic character called Henryk de Fejkowski. No one ever knew really where his money came from, but he had plenty of it. And he was great, and he, had horses, and there was a stable attached to this. And so we went to England, and we went to London, and shopped all around. So all of these great antiques came from dealers, But that was, the principal guest bedroom, and that was, there was Colfax and Fowler had the most beautiful showrooms in London in those days. And this was a great Colfax and Fowler hydrangea chintz. And so the bedroom was kind of a full-blown version of a Colfax and Fowler. But then years later, probably, this is a project I did in Tampa, Florida. Now at this point, I had probably been at Parrish Hadley 8 years maybe. And this young woman came to us. Her aunt had been a client, and we had done houses for her aunt in North Carolina. So this young woman was married, and she and her husband were building a house, and they were building this house with an architect who came out of Moultrie, Georgia, terribly nice Southern gentleman named Frank McCall. And she showed us the drawings, but she must have been in those days 27. And she showed us the drawings for this lovely brick Georgian-ish, Southern Georgian house. And Albert must have said to me, she seems very nice, you do it. And Albert was not a snob at all, but he thought, well, here she's young, you're young, talk to each other. Right. I ended up doing 5 houses for this client over the course of the years. But this was the first house we did together, and it was also, a very formal, proper house, very much in the spirit of Parrish Hadley. But when I look back on it, I can already see I was starting to push my imprint on it. It's like the other house, but I've sucked some of the color out of it. It's more monochromatic. I've used chintz in a more sparing way. It's a little more graphic. Here, the dining room, where Mrs. Parrish might have slathered it in chintz and pattern, we did there was a fantastic muralist called Chuck Fisher in those days, and he painted all of these chinoiserie scenes on bits of canvas, and it was made like an old English print room. Another great 4-poster bed. But again, I was starting to, my experience of looking at traditional country house decoration, but paring it down, trying to make it more appropriate maybe for a young family, and just sort of filtering it through my vision. So this project I show because, after I left Parrish Hadley in 1997, I set out on my own, and it was like, oh great, now what do I do? So these clients were really some of my first clients, and this was probably the first project that was published under my own DKDA banner, and it was just here on 64th Street and Madison Avenue for, again, a young couple, and they had 2 kids at the time. I think they hadn't had their third. And so while you see the English furniture in the room, lovely cock pen, open fretwork back chairs, I just completely erased all the pattern. I just took it all out. There's a lot of texture in the room, and it's still all that lovely, soft, beautiful, sort of upholstered furniture, those great, split back chairs that Mrs. Parrish loved, and the soft upholstery, but pattern was removed. But so the bones were all there. All that listening to, what makes a room comfortable? Mrs. Parrish, if there wasn't a table next to a chair, if there wasn't a lamp on the table, if you couldn't put your drink down, if she couldn't lie down on a sofa, she thought they were completely worthless. You can't take a nap on a sofa, why would you give it room space? She just thought. So this was really the first, whereas, in that room in Connecticut, there was this fantastic églamisé, black, red, and gold mirror over the mantelpiece. Here it's reduced to a circle. And I don't even know that I knew what I was doing. I was just sort of filtering things through my own vision. I loved all the mahogany furniture we were buying. Well, I didn't want a big old English four-poster bed, so I just kind of extrapolated from a great Georgian bed, a melon foot, and designed something, and I made this bed more than once.
But that's what I'm wondering, and you and I have talked about this a little bit. Were you resisting towards the end so much of the layering, and as you were saying, and the chintz and the pattern? I mean, you removed it all when you could on your own. What was going on for you? How were you thinking about it?
No, I really don't think I was. And people often say, they think of me as doing more monochromatic rooms, or and I've had clients say, well, you don't really like color, and I don't think that's the case at all.
I don't see that at all.
I don't see that at all.
This project says otherwise. I don't know. I'm torn.
I wasn't resisting. I think I was just, kind of responding to different things. I mean, I was responding to these clients as much as I was responding to my own interests at the time. I don't think I was resisting, and I still like a good chintz. This was the library, and
right.
So instead of a traditional mahogany panel library, it's a little hard to see. You can see on the far wall, the wall between the windows, all the paneling is flat. We just changed the veneer patterns. So it was just as if a kid had done a line drawing of a paneled room, and instead of a big kind of partners or pedestal desk, there's that kind of, modern-ish, Italian glass top table.
Which I love.
I put these pictures in because Dennis said we'd like to talk about mentorship, and mentorship to me is obviously not just who I worked for. Not everyone gets to work for world famous decorators and designers. I have always said, somebody once said to me after Albert passed away, they said, "Oh, did he leave you anything?" And I looked at them and I was so taken aback by that question. First of all, it seemed slightly rude. How much did he leave you? Kind of strange. What did he leave you, an object or something? And I looked at that and I said, "Do you mean did he leave me anything other than my career?" Because I really do feel that way. But not everyone, gets to work for people of that, kind of generosity, really. This was a house, and this house in the apartment that they're sort of. There was an antique dealer in my day when there were a lot of antique shops in New York, called Garrick Stevenson. And to me, Garrick Stevenson had arguably the best taste of anybody I knew, especially of an antique dealer. Stylish, he was a great dresser. He knew about food, about wine, about he was well-traveled. He had started his professional life as a young designer at Macmillan. He came from a family where, unlike me, he didn't necessarily need to work. And then he became an antique dealer. And he bought things that interested him, and if you wanted to buy them and he wanted to sell it to you, that was fine. And if you weren't interested, he didn't care. And he had great taste. So this was his house, and I knew him. And then years later, he asked me to work with him on the decoration of his houses, which to me was an incredible compliment because I had such respect for him. But I learned so much listening to this guy. And we started to look at mid-century furniture, and I have, over the course of my career, put together, I think, some rather impressive collections for my clients of mid-century furniture, and it's been a great privilege. So I started to look at it with Garrick. So in the previous picture, there is a plaster console by Serge Roche, a great pair of lacquer frame chairs by Jean Dunant, beautiful enameled vases, all of these things. And we would go to Paris together and London together and go shopping. And, you know, the dealers all knew him, and he was a great negotiator, you know, because he was a dealer's dealer. And so I learned so much just standing there listening, keeping my mouth shut. And so it was another kind of great mentorship. And I knew Garrick his whole life, all until he passed away. So this was the living room of this kind of modern house in Southampton, you know, just a giant sofa and kind of mid-century tables and rugs we made for it, you know, narwhal tusks. This was the apartment. He had a little pied-à-terre in New York. His children were grown and married, and he and Claire lived in this apartment, you know, and a great deco table, a beautiful Japanese enamel vase, a kine, the little bronze kine table, it's a Jean-Michel Franck screen. You know, we would go to dealers and, you know, you could still buy these things at prices that were not astronomical. They weren't cheap, you know, but then he had the wherewithal to do it. You know, the rug was, hide I cut up and put into squares. This is 30 odd years ago, you know, so it's, you know, and I shared the pictures with Dennis, and I said, you know, I take a certain amount of pride in the fact that I hope you can't put a date on it. And that's incredibly important to me. And also, the people that I looked at whose work mattered to me, you know, people like Henri Samuel, Jacques Grange, Albert, Billy Baldwin, people I hadn't known. Their work was, you know, Francis Elkins, their work was hard to pinpoint in a time and place. And that, you know, just mattered so much to me, and it still does. And so, you know, that's 30 years ago, more, you know.
Yeah, no, it's...
This was his little, his dressing room study, you know, that sort of fantastic little French chair, you know, that, you know, the legs look like cannons. The set of furniture is a suite of furniture by Jean Sen. You've seen copies of this furniture, but that's, you know, those are the original frames in the oak. The walls were covered in bark paper we chopped up into squares and outlined. You know, now there are a lot, I think one of the interesting things happening in the design world now is there are so many interesting artisan furniture makers who are doing these really interesting things, you know, with lights, with sculptural furniture, you know, bridging the gap between, you know, art and furniture. And I think there are so many people in the field doing that now. You know, so the mirror was made by a young furniture maker in Paris who was working, and it's kind of lead and mahogany. It was, you know, sort of something, you know, and Garrick was the kind of guy who would find interest in that, and he would be interested in doing that.
Well, so going back to this image, what is it that makes this timeless? What are the elements? How do you think about creating a space like this that could be published on the pages of Architectural Digest today?
Well, it's not lived in by a famous person, so it would never be an
Exactly. There's
Architectural
no celebrity
Digest today.
tie-in, so it couldn't get published today, sadly. But
I don't know. I think I'm sorry, it sounds ridiculous, but I think it's tasteful. And I think it looks comfortable. And I think it looks livable. And I guess, you know, the old adages, you know, is suitability, suitability, suitability. It's not without, you know, you wouldn't buy a pair of shoes that weren't comfortable. Well, maybe on occasion. But, you know, so I think some of it is that, in part.
I think it's so much more than that, though.
Well,
I think but it is striking. I mean, and that's that space as well. I mean, again, could be just off the pages. All right, so where are we now?
So this is a project I did not that long ago. It's a house in outside of Philadelphia on the main line. You know, beautiful field stone house, and I just show it because it's not like it's all linear. It's not like, oh, you're headed in one, at least for me, it's not like I was headed in one direction and I was keep going in that direction. This is a house, I'd done 3 projects for these people, and we actually moved them from a townhouse in New York into a house here. You know, in my office, we did a lot of the interior detailing of the house. We installed all this lovely, you know, kind of cerused oak paneling in the hall. We added this giant window in the stair hall. You know, I've been going to Morocco for 30 years, so any kind of Moroccan-inspired rug. So we used, you know, we had that put on the stairs. But a lot of this furniture, you know, we kind of detailed all the interior, you know, this room with the pilasters to give the room some interest. One of the things that I have always taken with me from Albert is get the bones of the room right. And that was drilled into me in the best possible way. So I have never been a decorator who thinks putting furniture in a room is getting your job done. And I look at things and I think, what did they do here? They painted the walls? I'm sorry to sound so dismissive, but you know, this room has presence, actually empty. And that is what Albert gave me and really taught me. And so, you know, we designed the mantelpiece and put it in, you know, but a lot of the furniture, you know, was repurposed from other places. But again, this was maybe 12 years ago, something like that. The family room in that house, a little bit more modern, a little bit more relaxed, a little bit more like what looks like something today, but again, not today. We did the kitchen. I show this picture. This house has never been published, and I always think, I don't know why I didn't publish this. I love this kitchen. Because I just think you know, the floor was so fun. That kind of country tiles floor is such a graphic element. You know, now you see two islands in kitchens all the time. It was just a kind of an idea we had for this kitchen. The lights, I'd found this funny light in the flea market in Paris, and we copied it for here. I say all the time, the other thing I got from Albert is I can't cook a thing. Don't cook, don't know any, you know, can't do anything in a kitchen, but I can tell you where everything should go. This room was added on. It's sort of like a winter garden breakfast room. And again, just, you know, a real amalgamation of some French pieces, some new pieces, some one of a kind. You know, we made the banquette. We, you know, had fun. But, you know, the other thing that's always been very important to me that I've always gotten from anyone I've looked at you know, and I devour things, and you know, my reference points are not Pinterest and are not magazines so much, they're books. And anyone who comes to my office, I mean, there are many people who have many more books than I do, but my reference points are books. And so it's important that to me, and interesting to me, and engaging to me as a designer, to work on a house that looks like that Fieldstone house or this. And that I would be asked to do both is what is interesting to me and what I've been able to do, and I'm so pleased with it. This is a project we just finished in Aspen. And so, you know, it has, but the rug kind of looks familiar. You see where I'm getting, you know, I mean, that rug looks like, there was a rug designer named Marion Dorn. Marion Dorn rugs had this great texture and geometry to them. Now, go back and find out who Marion Dorn was and look at her designs. You will think, oh, that's where that came from. I'm always interested, why do things look the way they do? Why does this chair look the way it looks? Why does this table look the way it looks? Well, that's always what it's interesting to me. Anyway, so that's a great, the hanging over the fireplace is by Olga de Amaral, a fantastic textile artist who I think is wonderful. This client bought all his own art. He's a great collector. He's full of fun. That's a Hockney, weirdly. Dining table, you know, 2 dining tables. You know, again, it's people in Aspen, nobody's eating at the same time. People come, people go, people have skied all day, somebody's going early, somebody's going late, you know, but you want to have 20 people to dinner, you want to have 6 people for breakfast, it's that kind of setup. Sort of a sitting room down by the guest bedrooms, a sofa we kind of copied from what's his name, Terrence? Pearsall. James? Yes. Pearsall. Albert was always great at saying, there's nothing new under the sun, and I have no shame in looking at something and ripping it off or reinterpreting it and sort of making it ours. The kitchen, just sort of show, rummaging through pictures. We worked with local architects from Basalt called CCY, who were really great to work with, and I think they did a great house. This is a project also recently finished, so I'm trying to show you, but I could say, when was this done? I don't know, maybe this, but this is here on Fifth Avenue, just opposite the museum. But again, in the Nothing is New Under the Sun, the floor pattern is totally ripped off from, all those great buildings in Milan. We just expanded the pattern, blew it up, made it a little more contemporary. But, I didn't invent it. The great overscaled, crown molding. I just came back from a trip. This was done before my trip to Egypt, but I was saying to Dennis, you look up at 100 temples in Egypt and you see this motif everywhere. I drove my guides in Egypt crazy because I kept saying, who is the architect? And they know a lot, which is really fascinating. It's like, who was the guy who first drew that entablature around the door? Who drew that crown molding? Like, where did that come from? Like, really? They just figured out Greek key was a Greek key? Like, how did they do that? I'm just ripping things off. Anyway, these are great clients. They're fascinating people. They have this terrific collection of mostly young contemporary Persian artists. Not these two. We put the European things in this room, the Calder sculpture, the Ingrid Donat tables. The sofas were based on a 40s, I thought 60, I forget where they came out of. We copied it. The dining table is a total ripoff of a Jules Leleu table. It was a coffee table from that period. I blew it up and expanded it. The walls are covered in sort of pewter finished Venetian stucco. The walls in this room are cerused oak. The Frankenthaler painting, but that quilted suede sofa is, it's in 6 or 8 rooms in the Henri Samuel book. That's, I go back to books. It's like, yeah, I'm going to do that sofa. That's gonna be someplace in my life. The bedroom, it's hard to tell. This bedroom was really a very soft, pale green color. But these sort of interesting Persian artists who are working all over the world now when they left Iran, and they're working all over. So, I always think people want to see pretty pictures. So this is, again, you work in a little modern glass box house in Aspen, or you work in a 40,000 square foot house in Beverly Hills. But the approach is it's all kind of the same. You start in the same place. It's like, but what's appropriate and what makes it work, and what do you bring to it? This house did not look this way at all. But my client and I sat, and she had her stack of books, and I had my references. And before I was hired, I sort of looked at her stack of books, and chief amongst them was a bunch of David Adler books, because she was looking for inspiration for the exterior of the house. And I thought, because when I pulled up to this house, I thought, this is not going to work. The house was not a nice house. It's on one of the most spectacular plots in Beverly Hills that looks over the whole city. It's an amazing space. And our office did all the interior detailing of this house, so it's just pouring through all those great reference books and architecture books and looking at paneling details and integrating all the contemporary and modern systems into it. But, it's still, those wonderful English, painted and gilded chairs. It's still, I haven't really changed, which is making me sort of depressed. except for looking so much older, but, you know, but there's still this, you know, it's still the arrangement of furniture. It's still, you know, there's a principal seating area, there's a secondary seating area, there's lamps, there's tables, there's side tables, there's, you know, I put ashtrays on them just because they're accessories, not that anyone smokes. It's the layering, you know, I mean, there are probably 5 rooms we've just looked at that have sort of a simple matting on the floor and then an antique rug, you know, these beautiful, you know, period mantelpieces that we went out and sourced to give the room, you know, to ground it in some period. But then, you know, that mirror is an amazing Serge Roche mirror that he was in his own residence. He actually presented that mirror to his wife on their wedding, which was sort of an extraordinary thing. You know, it's another Serge Roche table. So it's this mixture of periods and influences, but it's sort of, you know, all of that kind of goes into my, you know, blender, if you will. That dining table is, you know, an 18th century French table of Napoleonic era. It folds up into a table this big. It's insane. It's the craziest thing in the world. That rug ripped out of the Marion Dorn design book. You know, straight out of it. Waterford chandelier, but contemporary Jasper Johns prints that go around the room, an Art Deco sideboard. You know, it's just, you know, kind of the pull of all of it together. The library in that room, you know, the chandelier is Patrice d'Angèle. He's a contemporary maker of lighting fixtures and other things, works in plaster as well. But, you know, that's every Etruscan light you've ever seen in your life. It's just made modern, you know exactly why that light looks the way it does. Those wacky Russian chairs in the front with those insane arms, you know, they're like liquid chairs. They're kind of hysterical. The biggest Georgian desk I'd ever bought in my life. It's over 7 feet long. You know, but the mantle, the collection we did, it's in delicious brown onyx. I always say, you know, having a little Jasper Johns over the mantelpiece never hurts. You know, but in the middle of all of it is another, you know, a Royer table and a little Poilerat table, you know. But then the minimalist, you know, we hung the plain, you know, that fantastic Robert Ryman, you know, so with all this richness is this minimalist, you know, the essence of a minimalist painter, which is, you know, the holy grail to me. Like that is everything to me, which is even stranger. You know, this was my fantasy on every lattice room I've ever looked at. You know, so it was my just, you know, dreaming about, well, okay, make your lattice room. What would you make it look like? And so this was, you know, Dwayne, who worked with me in those days. It was our kind of riff on it. It took me, you see, there are 4 of those kind of keystones and niches in the room. It took me 7 years. How long, Scott? It took a long time to fill them up, to find the right things to go in. But, you know, it's a, you know, a 1960s dining, you know, table in it, but those chairs that are Francis Elkins model chairs and a parchment covered deco, you know, 1960s piece of furniture at the side. So again, you know, as I say, you know, why are these things looking the way they look? And that's where my head always starts. So of course, you have to have a ladies' powder room and a man's powder room, you know. You don't have a house in Beverly Hills unless you have a his and a hers powder room and a hair salon. Have to have a hair salon. I don't have pictures. So this is the women's powder room, and and again, it's a pure riff on kind of Indian fantasy with a European influence. So, you know, the table is kind of cabriole legs. You know, we put the sink in it, the etched onyx floor, and the carved plaster lower paneling is all out of Indian palaces. You know, it's just my, you know, riff on all of that. The panels above are by Nancy Lorenz, who's a fantastic artist, who works here in New York. She's not only an amazing talent, she's the sweetest thing on 2 feet. So, the master bedroom, just, you know, again, a little room, but we were looking at, Nancy and I were looking at curtains like this today. So these are curtains that Albert Hadley drew on one of my 6 p.m. sketches, you know. Albert his drawings were beautiful, and he had this great facility. You know, and so these asymmetrical swags and jabos, you know, I mean, curtains are kind of, nobody can make beautiful curtains the way they used to, but, well, the Schnellers still can. And, you know, but these were curtains that have been in my kind of wheelhouse and, you know, my toolbox for forever, you know. I mean, detailed differently, the fabric selection is different, but, you know, the first pair in this I made 40 years ago, you know, and you know, so there's still in my employ. But that table is a remarkable piece of furniture by Suémar. It's this amazing silver and gilded, you know, while I can like the most minimalist painting, I do have an appreciation for this completely over-the-top furniture. Again, her study, just a little thing, I'm just being silly and showing you, you know, a room with a ridiculous painting. This was this was one of the most fun rooms in the house to work on, which was sort of the indoor pool. And a lot of it came from finding the stone. That's actually, the walls are all stone and ceramic tile. And I found this wonderful stone with these great fossils in it, so that became kind of the start for the room. But these giant light fixtures were, you know, are a complete ripoff of André Arbus lights that, you know, were this big. And these things are 4.5 feet tall. We actually made full-scale models of them. So again, it's all, you know, it's just constantly going back to all the original references. So, you know, again, just to talk about going from, you know, that mad 40,000 square foot, very classic house, to this, a house in East Hampton, which rather pissed off the neighbors because of its scale, but it's, to me, a rather beautiful interpretation of a modern barn. And, you know, the thing I feel most proud of is being able to say, I worked here and I worked here. And that there is that kind of seemingly disparity between these things, but going back to the left brain of Albert Hadley and the right brain of Sister Parish, I'm able to do that because of the people I was exposed to, not because I'm so damn clever, but because I put myself in the way of people who were generous with their time and influence and knowledge.
And both of whom you think about all the time on every project that you're working on.
Their voice is in my ear, for sure. Yeah. You know, because I still think, I'm still asking Albert a question. And everyone, and clients have heard me say, I can't do that. If I stopped the paint and that point in the wall, Albert would have fired me. You know, he wouldn't have it. So yeah, no, I still hear their voice, and I still sort of think, what would they have done? Yeah, no, their influence was great, as is the influence of, you know, 30 years of talking to, you know, I say this all the time, I'm sorry people don't have the experience of standing and talking to antique dealers the way I did. You know, people say, well, you know a lot about furniture, and it's like, I don't know anything about furniture, but I listen to a lot of people. And you don't get that, you know, clicking. And that's you know, that's a loss, you know. It's that dialogue. It's that, you know, having dealers tell you why they are selling you what they're selling. Most antique dealers are not selling things because they want to make money, because it's a ridiculous thing to do if you think you're going to make money. So you do it because you're interested in it, because you believe, you're fascinated by it and you want to know about it. And I was saying, we went to, where's Jennifer? Anyway, we went with clients the other day to some antique dealers. It was so nice to take people to dealers, okay, let's go here. And Evan Lobel, who's now, he's become a kind of, dealer with real knowledge. In the period, he knows about, which is sort of, 70s, 80s furniture, and was telling the clients all about Philip and Kelvin Laverne. And, and he spoke and he talked about how they made what they made and the process they used to oxidize their furniture and what they were doing and why this was Etruscan and why this was astrological. And the clients were just fascinated because they were so interested in it. Well, I've been listening to people do that for years. And that's why I know anything about anything, because somebody way smarter than I am took the time to share their knowledge with me.
And that's so much of the learning that I know you wish people were getting more of.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's why I sit on the board of New York School of Interior Design, because I think that experience, I regret I didn't have it in some ways.
The schooling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm lucky I had what I had, but I also think, it's incredibly important to live it, to experience it, I mean, the people in my office, again, are bored to tears with me because I say, you need to talk to me about it because I actually just have more experience. I don't look this old for no reason. I've been doing it a long time and I've made that mistake. And I can tell you why it's a mistake and I can explain to you why we should do it a different way. And you're not going to get that sitting in a classroom. And you're not going to get a client yelling at you sitting in a classroom. And you're not going to get a piece of furniture that comes out of the crate broken in a classroom and figure out what to do with it and how to make it right and all of these things. It's not, design is, it's great to think of all these great things and sketch them up and put them on paper, but when it all comes, when you pick the box up and you hear it rattle, you think, what do I do now? What do I do? How do I fix this? So it's all of that. We've always got interns in the office. We've always got people. I've got people. Where's Matthew? Are you here? Is Matthew here? Anyway, he's here. Student. Yeah. I mean, I'm a huge proponent of it. I mean, I say, we were talking again. I'm just repeating myself, but you have to listen to me again.
And I love that I get to listen to you.
Somebody, you go to medical school. You don't open an office. You do a residency. Would you go to a doctor who hadn't done a residency? Like, why would you hire somebody who's just opening, gets out of school and says, okay, I'm a decorator. Oh, honey, we've all got great taste.
Well, and that's the thing. And if there was one resounding message to drive home from all of that, is just what you were saying. Go to work, go to learn. I was talking earlier with a guest here who was saying, go to learn on someone else's dime, which is one way to think about it.
Well,
sure.
I complain about it all the time. I say nobody taught me, I said nobody paid me to learn, but then I look back and I think, yeah, they did. They sure did.
Yeah.
They didn't pay me much, but but they sure did.
But they sure did.
Yeah.
And they gave you, again, you were there for many years for a reason. And Bunny, too, poor emaciated Bunny, who we saw earlier.
Yeah. Have you
was-
seen Bunny lately? She's poor emaciated Bunny again.
Yes.
She looks unbelievable.
She's on quite a fitness program.
She's fierce. Bunny's the best.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, but Bunny was there for, 20 years?
Yeah, well, more, yeah.
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 I don't know that, okay, I'm ridiculous. I didn't need to spend 16 years there. I spent 16 years there because I loved it. Anyone who knows me well enough to know if I'm not liking it, I'm not doing it. But that experience, I couldn't do what I do.
I wouldn't have the confidence, I wouldn't have the knowledge, I wouldn't have any of it. There's nothing that replaces it. And so the medical school analogy, while highfalutin, is sort of the best one I can say. Like literally, you know, you didn't do your residency, you know, no, sorry, you're not treating me.
Yeah, particularly, I mean, on projects of this size and scale and scope, right? I mean, can you imagine just starting out and taking that on?
I would be daunted by it. You know, I wouldn't know where to start.
Yeah.
You know, and even clients who own these things kind of are daunted, and kind of look at it and go,
Okay, we've got microphones floating around, and I would love for some audience questions. So, Karen has a microphone in her hand.
because I have all the answers.
Yes. Yes.
So, what was your most terrible client, and then how do you choose?
Oh.
I mean, not by name, but how do you? Are there red and yellow flags that you can see, given all your experience now, where you know you wouldn't want to work for a client?
Yes and no. I've been surprised and disappointed. So, oh wait, are we still talking about clients? No. You know, the worst clients are people who don't trust. That's just the A to Z of it. If they don't trust you, they won't engage and join. And it's a collaboration. What I do is a collaboration. I collaborate with everyone in my office. I collaborate with my clients. It's a collaboration. If they don't trust you and want to join you, it's not going to work. And sometimes you can sense that right away. Sometimes you don't. So that's probably what I would say. So sometimes you can tell, am I any better at it? Not really. I still think the best of people, and I get my teeth kicked in all the time. But to be perfectly honest, I've got a pretty nice roster of clients who are pretty appreciative and pretty receptive and pretty engaged. And so I guess I've managed to interpret what they were saying enough.
Thank you. What an amazing opportunity to have you walk through all your projects. I had a very specific question on material. Your apartment opposite the Met, what was the mantle or the chimney stack? I couldn't tell if it was stone or an installed piece of art. And I don't know if you can
So
scroll back.
the mantelpiece, that whole
Yes.
chimney breast wall is a wonderful sort of.
Could you scroll back?
Oh, certainly. Let me.
And these are not all the projects.
Yes, exactly.
The mantle. I cracked my glass.
You're so strong. You don't even realize your own strength.
The mantelpiece, we commissioned it. It's by a maker in Paris named Kiko Lopez. And Kiko works in mirror, and he kind of hand oxidizes the mirror.
Oh, wait,
and so it's a kind of mosaic of handmade mirror pieces.
Back. For the apartment.
It's in this one.
Apartment, but further back.
Jesus Christ!
Honestly.
That. So it's mirror.
Okay, but it is artist-made, commissioned.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And actually, if you go downtown to Maison Gérard, on 10th Street, you'll see a bunch of his mirrors. We used another one of his mirrors over a mantelpiece in another project, not in this group. And it almost looks like a Rothko because of the way he's oxidized it. And they're quite beautiful, and they're kind of magic, they're almost mysterious.
Another wonderful example of an antique dealer who can teach you so much.
Yeah, and
Benoit
also
from
an
Maison
example of
Georges.
an antique dealer who's working with people making things today because, it's not just about, a nice 18th century sort of, French chair by Senet. It's, working and encouraging makers today. So, there's, you go to Maison Gerard, he's got, he's been working with Carol Egan and, the bench and console and all those things Carol has made, I mean, he's developed that relationship and those designs, and now you see them in lots of things. So, that's a good dealer. A good dealer, whether it's an art dealer or an antique dealer, a good dealer is encouraging their artisans.
Indeed. Okay.
I also just had one suggested word when you were asked about what makes the design timeless. I would suggest the word integrity. I see that throughout
Well,
all of
thank
your
you.
work. Most of the pieces are amazing, but even the supporting cast has a lot of integrity
Well,
to it.
that's very kind. Thank you.
Okay, one last question. Yes, up here in the front.
Hi.
Here, let me get you a microphone really
No, I
quickly.
don't need one.
There we go.
Great. Much better. Okay. So it seems like you have a lot of furniture made and a lot of that you get like antiques that you source. Are there any furniture companies now or like newer things that you're into?
You mean catalog things?
Not necessarily catalog, but like
You mean catalog things?
yeah, like dirty, filthy.
No.
catalog.
I don't say that disparagingly.
No.
And Daniel will back me up on this. We've just been exploring.
Hardware, that's so-
We've just been
Yes.
exploring showrooms because we're working on a project where we will want to buy things that aren't kind of custom made and bespoke. I can't rattle them off, partly, and this is where I will sound sort of snobby, and you can go home and say what an ass. But there's a part of me that really thinks, what do they need me to walk up and down the aisle and pick things for them? Now, granted, I might show them things that they're unaware of. That's an important part of our job. That's a very essential ingredient. But there's a part of me that says, they don't need me to take them to Holly Hunt.
Right.
Good or bad. They don't need me to take them to, the Agra. They need me to do something else. At least that's the way I probably made my life much more difficult as a result of it. But we've been going to some, there are some kind of contemporary Italian things and things that I could never make and wouldn't even think to make or know how to make. And so I've been looking at that, and that's kind of interesting and kind of fun. And we're doing this project in Tel Aviv, and we're going to use some of that stuff. And that's sort of fun and kind of pushing me out in a different way. Of course, the guy who's making the dining table is Israeli, and it is bespoke, and it is one of a kind thing. And you know what? And the fact of the matter is, I've worked 40 years, and I've worked really long and really hard, and that's where I've gotten to, so I'm able to do it. So that's also part of it, and I fully respect that that's not everybody's world, but I've scratched and clawed and kicked and apparently ate really nasty hard-boiled eggs to get here.
With the nail polish and the shell, I mean, yeah. Will you please join me in thanking our listeners?